We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, welcome back, folks. Besides Afghanistan, what has been at the top of everybody's mind is the infrastructure bill. And look, there's been a lot of consternation from a lot of conservative media on the 19 senators that voted for, Republican senators that voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And maybe some of that is deserved, but I do want to get into it in a little bit more detail and tell you what the pros and cons of it are. My initial assessment of it, it's not nearly as bad as some people are saying it is. It's also not that great. I think it's too expensive. But it is not as if these senators voted for a human infrastructure bill, which is, I think, what a lot of people think happened. It's not exactly what happened. But let's get into it, and let's talk about what it even means to have an infrastructure bill. Why it's useful, why it isn't, how much it should cost, and how we should generally be thinking about infrastructure development in the United States. To help us with that conversation, because I'm pretty good at this, but not an expert. We're going to have Ed Glaeser back on, Professor Ed Glaeser from, he's been on before. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor at City Journal. Professor of economics at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1992. And also, this is his second time on the podcast. And Ed, has this been your greatest honor to be on this esteemed podcast twice?
Oh, easily, Representative Crenshaw. No, it's not even close. The honorary degree from the Swedish Academy, nothing relative to this. So
well, we appreciate it. That's for sure. We appreciate you lending us your expertise yet again. So before we actually keep moving on, I'm going to really quickly run through some of the things, not the price tags on these things, but some of the things that are in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that has caused so much consternation. And I'll start off by saying I still think it's too expensive. But when I look at what's actually in it, it's not that what we're spending it on is absolutely terrible. It's not exactly the progressive human infrastructure items that everybody thinks it is. It's things like bridge repair. It's federal highway program money, roads, bridges, major projects, bus transit, rail systems. There's some EV infrastructure, electrical vehicle infrastructure, which I'm not a huge fan of, but that's a pretty small part of it. Airports, ports, waterways, flood mitigation and water infrastructure, the kind of thing that's pretty important in Houston. Clean drinking water, high-speed internet, environmental remediation, just power infrastructure. And there's a variety of offsets, but I think anybody honestly looking at this believes that the offsets don't possibly make up for the entire spending bill. We're still, there's just been various estimates on this, but I think still lacking a few $100 billion of pay-fors. So that's generally what's in it without going into a massive amount of detail. Just for everybody's awareness, just so everybody knows generally what we're talking about. What is missing from the conversation, Ed? I mean, just if you just want to react to the sort of general discussion, then let's get into some more details from there.
So I think there are two things that are missing from this. First of all, with most forms of infrastructure, there really should be a strong presumption that the users should pay the costs, right? There's just no reason why we want, federal tax dollars raised in Nebraska to pay for John F. Kennedy Airport, right? There's no reason why we want, things that protect Florida's expensive seaside real estate to be paid for by taxpayers in Houston. The principle of user pays was a great principle at the start of America's infrastructure bridge. I mean, the Erie Canal, which is surely among the most successful infrastructure projects ever put together, right? Paid for itself, I think, within 3 years through tolls. And particularly if you think about infrastructure like highways that is likely to be used disproportionately by goods producers, by the shippers of freight, for goodness sakes, why not let them pay? So that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is more cost-benefit analysis, right? There are very few areas in which it's easier to waste billions and billions of dollars on white elephants than infrastructure. And so we really have got to get into the habit of saying, before we do anything new, you don't have to do this with every road repaving. I mean, repaving roads is by and large a very good thing to do, and it's, maintenance of existing projects is pretty easy to justify. But before you do anything else big, we owe it to ourselves to actually try and figure out whether or not this will deliver enough benefits to offset the costs.
Well, and then that makes a lot of sense. One thing I want to ask about too is the difference between federal spending on infrastructure and, say, the problem solving that often happens at a more local or state level. When we want to build something here for flood mitigation, for instance, we had a bond sale, $2.5 billion worth. The Houston Ship Channel is being largely paid for by private investors who want to use it. And then, so there's a public-private relationship, a partnership that's materializing from them, where the Army Corps of Engineers will pay for operational costs, maintenance costs in the longer run. But the main initial investment is done from private actors. That kind of problem solving, there's no incentive to do that kind of problem solving if there's just a giant federal spending bill. Because why would there be, right? Like, why would I even think about spending my own money when I can? My time is now better spent trying to get the grant money from the federal government. And you got to wonder what the efficiency of that is.
There's a lot to like about local control and local spending, right? So the further you are between who pays for it and who is actually using it, the more likely you're going to have a mismatch between costs and benefits, between projects that people need and projects that get built. So that doesn't mean that this current infrastructure bill can't have more of that, but it needs to be then put into the implementation more clearly. I mean, it needs to be inserted in more strongly. But I think in general, your point that a lot to like about local problem solving is surely correct.
Yeah, and not just local problem solving, but actually, let's talk about the user fees real quick. I mean, one of the things that people were really mad about in this infrastructure bill was mileage fees for cars. Can you explain sort of the costs, the pros and cons of a user fee, basically as opposed to a gas tax, right? You either, if you're going to get people to pay into the federal highway system, you either have to increase the gas tax to make up for it, or you have some other kind of user fee which looks at mileage. And what I think a lot of my Republican colleagues don't realize, because they're claiming it's a tax on the rural areas. I'm not sure. Again, if it's a choice between gas and mileage, I'm not sure what their argument is, because either way, people who drive longer distances are going to feel the pain from that. I'm not sure they realize that's actually a compromise to get at the people with electric vehicles who are using roads but not a lot of gas. I mean, can you comment on that really quick?
You're exactly right. So the whole point about the mileage taxes are that people are frustrated that electric vehicle drivers aren't paying for any of the costs of highways. I mean, it's also just been true that we've been very reticent to raise the gas tax over the last 30 years. It's very politically unpopular. And since I don't have to run for office, let me just make the case of why I think it's right that people should pay for the roads that they use, right? So it's socially just that you should pay for the things that you get. It's appropriate that you should pay for costs when you engage in some degree of wear and tear on the road. And it's probably right that you should pay a little bit for the risks that are created through people potentially dying on the highways and from congestion. All of those things are reasons why having a moderate amount of a charge for driving is a totally reasonable thing. I mean, I think it is entirely Republican sentiment to believe that, we cover our own costs in this world, that if we're imposing costs on infrastructure, we should be actually paying for that. And that principle has just gotten lost somehow. And, I certainly believe that it should be reinserted on this. And it's certainly, we shouldn't worry very much about it, whether it's a gas or a mileage tax, because as you say, the whole point of mileage taxes are to tax urbanites who are more likely to drive electric cars.
Mm-hmm. And one other question I have is, actually, maybe I should just start with a broader question. There's actually disagreement and some smart people who say, look, this crisis of a lack of infrastructure in the United States, this idea that we're just not building anything and that everything is crumbling, is a bit of an overstatement. What do you say to that? I mean, do we really need a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill right now?
Well, so it is certainly true that when the Society of Civil Engineers gives us terrible grades for our highways, that is somewhat at odds with the fact that the actual data on road roughness appears to be going in the opposite direction. We appear to have roads that are actually much smoother than we used to have in the 1980s, according to the Department of Transportation's own data. They send out these trucks, they actually measure road roughness, and that's actually better than it was in the early testing, when oddly the American Society of Civil Engineers actually gave us a higher grade than they do today. So it's a sort of strange thing. And I think by most measures, I mean, there are particular forms of American infrastructure. Famously, John F. Kennedy Airport is often used as being a poster child for infrastructure dysfunction. But I am sure there are very few of your listeners who would favor, taxing Texas to pay for the, by and large, quite wealthy people who fly in and out of JFK. That should be something that should be paid for by user fees on the flyers. So there are certainly things that America can do better in terms of infrastructure. But whether or not this is the right number or not, I don't know. And I think certainly the more that this money is leveraged with, coupling it together with user fees or various public-private partnerships, the more that we'll get for it. So the key now is to be, once we've got this money, the key is to be smart about using it.
Yeah. And, speaking of being smart and looking at projects that are vetted, it seems to me that something like the Army Corps of Engineers, all the projects that are in waiting for the Army Corps of Engineers, there's a backlog of money that if they got about $100 billion right now, that there are legitimately shovel-ready projects ready to go. And shovel-ready in the actual shovel-ready sense, not the sort of fake sense that we had back in 2008. But these are projects that have gone through all of the hurdles already, permitting, et cetera, and could go right now. And they have a very stringent cost-benefit analysis that takes place there. I mean, when you talk about flood mitigation projects, that's generally what we're talking about. We're working with the Army Corps of Engineers and such. I mean, but that's certainly not $1.5 trillion. And in any case, you would think from a lot of the rhetoric that we're just not building anything. Now, of course, any American that's just that takes a drive to their local grocery store sees that we're always building things. It is not, we're always doing maintenance. It's not as if nothing is happening. We're all just waiting to get this massive infrastructure bill. And I always just like to take it back a few steps and say, like, does the reality match the rhetoric of crisis that we're seeing? And my feeling is that no, it doesn't. And it's not that we don't want some spending on this. I mean, it's pretty obvious that we can simply transfer a lot of the COVID spending to infrastructure, but that's not 1.5 trillion. I think it's about $500 billion, which is still an enormous amount of money. But that for some reason that's not even on the table as far as an option, and I have trouble figuring out why. I will say this bipartisan bill does improve upon permitting processes a little bit. I'm not sure it does to the extent that a lot of Republicans would like. Maybe can you talk for a second about how important that is? I mean, one thing I say a lot is you can't spend a lot more money on infrastructure if you keep making it hard to build infrastructure. It seems like a silly thing to do.
So one of the things that I do is I co-lead a National Bureau of Economic Research project on infrastructure, and this is actually something I should have disclosed to begin with. That which it does receive funding from the Department of Transportation that started 2 years ago and it continues. So that's a disclosure that I should have made. But one of the papers that we've supported with that, which is one of my absolute favorites, is on the evolution of the cost of highways. So the Leah Brooks and Zach Liskow, Leah's at George Washington University, Zach's at Yale Law School, have put together data on the cost of highways over the last 70 years. And, they got, substantially more expensive between the 1950s and the 1980s. I think that's, by the way, just as a broader question for us to figure out why it is that infrastructure costs so much in the United States, right? We don't fully know the answer to this, but certainly the difficulty of getting through various forms of permitting are part of it. And what they looked at was, they found that it wasn't any of the inputs. It wasn't as if the asphalt was getting more expensive. It wasn't as if the labor was getting more expensive. what did seem to be happening is the roads were getting a lot more zigzaggy, if that's an adjective that I can use. They're much less straight. They're much more likely to be built with additional mitigation, walls to protect them from neighboring communities, various other things, which looks like they were accommodating the community in different ways. Now, we all in Massachusetts, we lived through this because we lived through the Big Dig, which came in, it was sold to Massachusetts voters in the early days with, oh, this is federal money, so we don't need to worry about it. Of course, the federal money ended up only handling a tiny fraction of the $18 billion bill. But one of the reasons why it was $18 billion was it was spent in a way, it was built in a way so that no one had to move their houses. No one had to be relocated. And, this sort of hypersensitive way of dealing with everything, this hypersensitive way can actually just blow up the price tag. And we really do need to ask, if we're going to be spending $1 trillion on infrastructure, are we buying it at the right price, or are we, buying infrastructure at a vastly higher price because we've made decisions about not bugging anybody, right, in a way that just goes too far.
Well, and the other question is which should come first? The giant price tag on that we're just going to spend this money on infrastructure, or the assessment for need for projects, and then see how much we can get that for. Again, this is kind of why I go back to the Army Corps of Engineers analysis, because that assessment's been done, and so now at least we know what the price tag is. That seems to be how we would buy things as normal consumers. Why wouldn't we buy it that way as public consumers?
Right. And I wouldn't be an economist if I didn't also add that if you think that American infrastructure is really expensive to buy, then you probably should want to buy a little less of it. Just in the same sense that if you think that a grocery store is particularly expensive, you should probably want to buy a little less there.
Yeah, and that's what's caused me personally, as somebody who does have to vote on this, some consternation is not just the price tag, but the fact that the price tag is on the heels of the $6 trillion we already spent for COVID, which is which is not good. What do we you've written a lot about economic trade-offs too, and maybe you can comment on that. Specifically, you write about how when we tend to do federal infrastructure, it actually tends to go to the wrong places. And in fact, it goes to declining areas that don't require it. They're maybe losing population, and not so much the places that are vastly increasing population and would probably need it more.
So I believe that. I also think that it's important in terms of cost-benefit analysis how much the place can adjust in response to it. So this is a big case for, building in Texas, right? Because in fact, if you build something in Texas, you can then build housing next to it, because no one's going to say that you can't build the housing that's around it. If you build in coastal California, you build in coastal Massachusetts, the land use controls are so stringent that it becomes very hard to adjust the housing stock to the new forms of infrastructure. So that's one thing you really need to take into account, which is not just the number of people who are there today, but how many people will be there tomorrow if you build it. So I wrote a column for the New York Times about 6 months ago that, into this infrastructure bill should be squeezed a requirement that at least somewhere we should throw money at areas that make it easier to build and take money away from areas that make it harder to build. Now, given the fact that the places that are easier to build tend to be red states and the places that are harder to build tend to be blue states, I can understand why maybe that wasn't such a popular thing among the
New York Times readers, especially.
Among the New York Times readers. But I'm sticking with it. The other mistake, which you alluded to, is this thing that, this magical thinking that somehow that you're going to build a monorail in downtown Detroit and it's going to bring Detroit back, right? Most declining places have tons of infrastructure relative to their needs, right? You can run a bus at basically any speed you want in downtown Detroit, right? Because the streets are underutilized. It's a city that was built for 1.85 million people that has less than half of that. You don't need a monorail to glide over empty streets. That makes absolutely no sense. So you really have to ask what the region needs. And, what Detroit needs are more cops and more education. It doesn't need more infrastructure. Whereas there are parts of Texas, there are parts of that absolutely do need more infrastructure, especially those that are at risk from flooding.
Yeah, the flood mitigation is big for us. I mean, it's interesting. Let me just put this really bluntly. Why do Democrats love rail so much? Like, what is it about it? Maybe it's because the most liberal cities are just built for a subway system. I mean, you live in Boston, right? That it's built for a subway. It makes a lot of sense to have a subway system in New York. It makes a lot of sense to have a subway system. But the Democrats here in Houston also want rail. And it makes no sense to have rail in what is a suburban urban sprawl. It would be completely useless and probably offer no benefit whatsoever. But it's an obsessive inclination of the left, and I'm not sure why.
There is an old joke that 40 years of transportation economics at Harvard can be boiled down to 4 words: bus good, train bad. And the thing is, if you wanted to help the poor of Houston, right, and ensure more mobility, which is something I believe very much we should be doing, we should be focusing on this incredibly inexpensive technology called the bus, which does not commit you to particular areas, which you can flexibly lease the things, you can adapt to new technologies, right? You can put in electric buses, you can put in autonomous buses, and if you really want them to go fast, you can build lanes for the buses to go on all by themselves, right, at a fraction of the cost of putting in rail. So it's very hard to get rail to work in all but the very densest parts of America. So I know there is a fascination with rail, but I have long been on the record confirming that it was exactly the right technology for the 19th century, but it's very unclear that it's the right technology for the 21st century.
Yeah, it seems that way. I mean, again, it is nice to be on a train, I guess. There's something nice about it, but it just kind of depends on where you're at. I think it's just always fascinating to me how that plays out.
It's smoother, but we can make buses nicer too.
Yeah.
Right? Buses don't need to be as crappy as they often are.
That's true. And now the next question escaped me for a second. What was it? It was, okay. Here's another very simple and blunt question. If I'm a politician, which I am, and in my campaign promises, I want to say, I'm going to end traffic. I mean, I can't imagine a more popular campaign slogan. If we're being perfectly honest, I mean, what do people hate the most? They hate being in traffic, and it's kind of amazing that's never really been a campaign slogan, not even for like city mayors running. But if you were to actually say that with a straight face, what would your first ideas be from a policy perspective to improve traffic flow in our major cities? Because it's becoming, maybe it's not a problem in Detroit, but most other cities where
Sure.
especially in Texas, I mean, we're seeing growth. I don't see any space to make the highways wider. I suppose we could build above, maybe below. That's unbelievably expensive. Look at the Big Dig, for instance. What would be your ideas?
And I would remember, if you build more, right, you will get more drivers. I mean, there's something called the fundamental law of highway traffic, which has been identified by the economists Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner, that seems to show that, highway miles traveled increase roughly 1 for 1 with highway miles built. So if you build it, they will drive it, and you're not even going to fix traffic congestion in the long run. The problem is there is this magic bullet for fighting traffic. The problem is it will lose you every vote that you gained by saying that you were going to fix traffic, which is congestion pricing, right? Which is actually charging people for the congestion that they create. You can have, at this point in time, you can have time varying congestion pricing. You put it on during peak hours, you take it off. It's absolutely crucial when it comes to autonomous vehicles, right? If we introduce autonomous vehicles and make them the norm without also having congestion pricing on them, you have just radically decreased the cost of sitting in traffic. So guess what? More people will sit in traffic, and our congestion problems will get even worse thanks to autonomous vehicles. We really need to, at least with the autonomous vehicles, introduce the principle that you're going to pay for the congestion that you create. London's had this for 15 years now. Singapore has had this for over 45 years. And Singapore moves pretty swiftly because they actually charge people for the social costs of their driving. Now, I know that it's political poison, Congressman, and I'm not actually I'm saying this so you don't have to. But it is, in fact, the right economic answer is to actually charge people during peak hours for driving and, push people towards smoothing their driving in different ways, push them towards carpooling more, push them towards other solutions. You need to have public transit options if you're going to do that. But that doesn't need to be rail. It could just be, relatively common and flexible bus service.
Would you have to? How would you do that realistically? Would you have to actually install some kind of meter on everybody's car? How would you do that?
Going forward with the autonomous vehicles, I think that's a no-brainer. Yes,
Yeah,
you have the transponders in the car. Yeah. The cars are directly linked. It's hard to do without some form to do it really efficiently without an electronic transponder. The low-tech way to do it, remember, Singapore was a poor place when they did it in 1975, is you just pay a flat fee to drive on the highways during weekdays.
Yeah.
So pay a flat fee. You then, I guess, have to just put that in online, or in the old days, you just bought a certificate, which you put in your car. And if you are driving on those highways without paying the flat fee, they charge you a big fine. Right. So that's the lower tech way of doing it. So there are lots of ways of implementing it, but I think the right way going forward is some sort of a GPS transponder-based system.
I thought you were going to say flying cars, but I guess I'm working on that. Okay, yeah. The more I think about this, it's not that unserious of a conversation. There's some very interesting technologies that are up and coming, and we were promised as '90s kids growing up in the '90s that by the year 2000, the millennium would be around the corner and we would have flying cars, and it just never materialized. And there's a lot of '90s kids with their troll dolls that are very upset about this. So
there was a lot of Uber energy on this at one point in time. I don't know if it's still going on, but there's a lot of Uber energy around sort of vertical technology for doing this. I would guess it's going to be a fairly elite thing before it ever becomes a mass market solution. But
as many things are, I mean, televisions were an elite thing for a while, and that's what got them down to the right price point where everybody else could afford them.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about just economic analysis of infrastructure for a little bit. Again, the proponents of a massive infrastructure bill will say, well, it'll pay for itself 5 times over because of, it's just it's the multiplier effect and all that. And it's just, and my answer to that is, it's probably yours too. Well, it depends. And so where does that analysis get tricky? What's the proper way to look at the multiplier benefits of a dollar spent on infrastructure?
So just to be clear, an extra dollar of GDP is not an extra dollar of benefit, right? Because it actually means that, people are exerting effort to get that extra dollar of GDP. People are exerting, inputs to get that. So you need to be really careful about things that are straight benefits and things that are GDP that might yield benefits, right? I mean, if you have underutilized resources and they're going into, then the extra output gets counted sometimes, but you need to be really careful about that. We have not yet, I can say this has been a very frustrating thing, and I certainly felt this during the 2007-2008 period, is there never has been a good integration of macro benefits into micro cost benefit analysis, right? No one's ever really reached consensus on how to do this, and it is certainly important. I think there is a wide division among macroeconomists on to how big this is. So Jim Paterba and I did an edited volume. This was supported by the Smith Richardson Foundation on American infrastructure investment. And it's a National Bureau of Economic Research volume. And we have an excellent paper by Valerie Ramey, who is deeply skeptical about the spillover benefits of infrastructure. And then there are other people who are much more enthusiastic about it, who actually believe it's so. But part of the problem is that, there are things that are micro things that are done, like, give you a simple example, like rent control. Rent control has been done in hundreds of different cities at various points in time, and I can tell you that it screws up property markets over and over again, right? Because it's a micro thing, right? These macro things are very much based on particular points in time, and it just becomes very hard to be very confident about any of these effects. So I would be very wary before you turn to those macro spillovers as being your primary justification of infrastructure. The primary justification of infrastructure should always be that you're delivering enough benefit for the actual users of that infrastructure. And if you're way short on that, then think a long time before going ahead with that infrastructure.
So, this brings us into another subject, but related. You've advocated for a microeconomic approach to identifying projects. So, what is that exactly, and how does that improve decision making?
So again, I think it's about, you could do this either with, the current state level choice, which is fine, but you just have some degree of requirement of showing a relatively high cost benefit analysis number for this, or you could do it with a national infrastructure bank in principle, which could seek out high cost benefit, high net benefit projects. So you do this by considering some set of projects which get proposed. You then have some independent agency engage in some form of cost benefit analysis, and you figure out which one of these things is yielding the highest benefits per dollar spent. Right? That's the most standard way to do this. This is the micro approach. If you are very confident that one project is going to yield more macro benefits than another, then that's fine. But most of the time, you wouldn't have any reason to be very confident about that, and so you should go for the projects that yield the largest micro benefits.
Okay, that makes sense. Another example, which is interesting, is Japan. had a massive infrastructure building initiative between 1991 and 2008, yet they had anemic growth and their debt to GDP ratio is over 230%. What did they do wrong, though? I mean, did they just assume that every project would pay off? Did they fail to incorporate a really disciplined micro approach to evaluating projects? Or what can we learn from that?
I think it just shows that infrastructure is not enough to, correct all tailwinds in terms of the economy. And it's also important to remember that the benefits of infrastructure are a lot higher when you start from a low level of infrastructure development than when you start from a high level of infrastructure development. So the Erie Canal was really, really valuable because, look, in 1816, it cost as much to ship goods 30 miles over land as it did to ship them across the entire Atlantic Ocean. And there were Americans sitting on the edge of this incredible continent, right, with their arms outstretched trying to get to it, and they couldn't do it. And so the Erie Canal radically reduced the cost of shipping goods across space. So did the trains that followed, right? And so did the early highways. These were all radical changes. By the early 1990s in Japan was pretty well built out. I mean, they had bullet trains by that. They had pretty fast means of going around. So added infrastructure was a really incremental change. And when you try to choose projects in the U.S. as well, you need to ask yourself, is this going to be a revolutionary thing, or is this a fairly incremental thing given the existing ability to get around?
So there's a decreasing marginal benefit to infrastructure building, right? Because you do hear that argument sometimes. Look, we did this massive infrastructure, federal highway system before. That was when we were all in this together. We were all doing it. And why can't we go back to that? It was so great. It was just this sort of national good sense. But as you say, it's like, well, that's not necessarily the case now. Times have changed.
I would guess the largest benefits are going to be ones where we actually are paying attention to new technologies. I mean, for the first time, it really seems as if transportation technologies are moving again. I mean, it's sort of amazing in my life that, like, the stuff today is really not that different than the stuff was 50 years ago when I was a kid. I mean, the cars aren't that much faster. They're safer, certainly. They're not that much faster. The planes are kind of not that different. The trains aren't that much faster. But now with autonomous, electric, there's a bunch of things which could really change things. And so, like, if I were thinking about where infrastructure could really be revolutionary, I would be thinking about things like dedicated highways for autonomous vehicles, let's say running from Dallas to Houston, where it's all autonomous and those things can go 150 miles an hour because you're not having anything else on them. So, part of the problem with autonomous is if you have autonomous and non-autonomous together, all sorts of, problems go on. But if it's just a lane that's pure autonomous and you build it so basically the road can talk to the cars and keep them sufficiently far apart, you have a lot of possibility for doing something really great, but it needs to be, you need to use the new technology. You need to not just think that, we're going to go back to old stuff that we're doing. We need to think about how to be smart about how to leverage those new technologies to increase mobility.
Are you familiar with the Texas Central project from Dallas to Houston? It's a potential rail project, basically a bullet train back and forth between Houston and Dallas.
So I know a little bit about it. So I remember that, as skeptical as I often am about rail, my recollection for this project was it was overwhelmingly private money. Is that correct? Or is that changed?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
So I feel much better. Whether or not it's a good idea or not, I think investors should be free to lose their own money if they want to lose their own money. That's the and they may well not lose their own money.
That's fair. Do you think the other critique of the infrastructure bill is that it might cause even more inflation than we have now? Do you think that as it's currently written, do you think that's the case?
Look, I don't opine on, again, inflation is a macro topic, but I would say that, debt is not free. Okay, debt, trillions and trillions of dollars of national debt is not free and will lead to, either expectations about higher taxes or expectations about printing money in the future, which will mean higher inflation. This is not so I wouldn't see inflation as being a separate worry in my case, but I just, I'm old fashioned. I just think that, it's not free to spend more money, and we've been spending an awful lot of it lately, as you pointed out at the beginning of the talk.
Yeah, we certainly have. The other thing about it is I think some people voted for this bill thinking it's politically popular, because generally if you just ask an American in a survey question, do you think we should have more infrastructure? Yeah. I mean, who's going to say no? So it's you got to take these questions with a grain of salt. But and so they can say so it's politically popular, but I'm actually not so sure about that, because I think your average American is less and less concerned with the massive amount of debt we have. Unfortunately, we need to be more concerned with that. But the reality is that people just aren't, especially when you start talking about what would be required to reduce that debt. and what would it take away from them, which they feel they have earned or that they have a right to. It's kind of a separate problem. But the point is that when you add that much more money to the debt, and they don't see these golden towers popping up all around them, they're going to be pissed off. And I promise you, you won't see any golden towers popping up around you. I mean, infrastructure is a very long-term investment, and it's often in things you probably can't even see, that might have some benefit for you, that might not. And again, it just gets back to how careful we have to be about how we analyze it. But that's more of a comment than a question, but you're free to react to it.
No, I think we should address every dollar that we spend with the seriousness as if it came out of our own pocket, and anything less than that is just not what taxpayers deserve.
Do you think there's such a thing called human infrastructure, which is the other $3.5 trillion that we're talking about this week?
I found that a bit frustrating, because I don't think that something's good because you call it infrastructure, or bad because it's not infrastructure. There's certain things like investing in vocational training programs for especially experimental ones for low-income kids that I think are great things for federal money to be doing, even though I wouldn't call them infrastructure at all. And that human infrastructure included an awful lot in home health care workers. That is not a topic that I study, but I could well believe that investing in home health care workers was a good thing to do. But it certainly is not what's traditionally meant as infrastructure, which is a word that really came into England from French. It's supposed to be, infrastructura from the Latin, the stuff that goes below the structures. So it was used traditionally to talk about the rail network. That was the traditional origins of this thing. So I don't think it does much good to change the definition of infrastructure in some way to include a larger definition. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to necessarily think about, there are lots of cases in which I think spending on things other than structures is the right thing to do, especially, especially things around education. And education, of course, the other big thing, which I would love to see even more energy on, is, you would have thought that what we've learned over the past 2 years is that this country and the global economy is extraordinarily vulnerable to pandemic. I would have thought that, that would have been a pretty top priority for whatever we are going forward on this. So whatever you think is the right infrastructure to protect us against pandemic, that would seem like a reasonable thing, whether or not you call it infrastructure or not.
Yeah, that's probably a much longer conversation for sure. One of the other arguments on infrastructure is it's going to create a bunch of jobs. What do you think of that argument, especially right now, since I believe we have like 10 million job openings at the moment, many of which are high-paying jobs. And it's something I hear from business owners all the time. It doesn't seem to matter what price point they raise wages to, and it's well above $15 an hour, just to be clear. I mean, well above that. And they're still having trouble getting people. Maybe they don't make quite that much by staying at home, but you get to stay at home, right? And so that's factored into their analysis. That probably should end in September. It doesn't. I don't think Democrats have the votes to keep that going. To keep these unemployment benefits going, which are largely keeping people out of the workforce. But do you have any comments on that just the entire situation on our labor market and what we can expect to see over the next 6 months?
It's hard to know, but the general point that jobs are the only jobs you want to count, right, are people that you have genuinely taken off of federal benefits and moved into being taxpayers, right? Because that does generate a genuine social benefit, which is these people have stopped requiring some form of federal subsidy, and now they're earning a living, and now are paying it in. Those numbers are hard to understand even during the height of a recession. So the work of Andy Garin, now at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, found that it took more than $100,000 per job during the Great Recession. So it takes more than $100,000 to generate a sort of new form of new person working in the area. And those jobs are very localized towards construction. They also, remember, many infrastructure jobs, infrastructure isn't, the 1930s anymore, where you've got a bunch of guys sitting with picks and axes shovels by the side of the road. This is a pretty high-tech industry, right? You don't build a tunnel with sort of low-tech workers. And so those engineers tend to be pretty well employed. So the idea that you're pulling millions off of the welfare rolls, that's pretty hard to fathom. So I tend to think, especially now, but even more generally, infrastructure is really best thought of as a policy to create mobility or other benefits for the actual users, not as something that you're creating a benefit for the people working there, right? Yeah. And in general, right, we shouldn't think about work as being a beneficiary. The reason why we have federal, jobs is not as a benefit for the people who are working on them, right? It's the benefit for ordinary citizens, right? That's the whole bloody point of having a federal government or a local government, is you're of service to the larger economy, not that you're giving out, this great perk of having a federal job. So,
every time I talk to somebody who's in the construction business, their main issue is they have trouble finding workers. So there isn't all these workers sitting on the sidelines just wishing that they'd be hired by some construction company. It's just not true.
Yeah. So, choose the projects based on what they're delivering in terms of value to the users, not on the alleged employment benefits.
Well, Ed, we've debunked some myths. We've gotten some clarification on infrastructure, and it's greatly appreciated. The listeners have loved it, and they're probably gonna tell all their friends about this podcast and give me 5 stars. And what that does for me, I'm not sure, because I can't monetize this thing, so this doesn't really matter. But it makes me feel good, and there's some, I guess in economic terms, there's some social value to feeling good. So we really appreciate your expertise on this, and thanks for coming back on.
Thank you, Representative, and thank you for your service to our country.
I appreciate it.